Towers is an hour-long, 4-track, dark ambient album created in 2019. It was made by one of the people in Death Dynamic Shroud, and the person who owns the label Geometric Lullaby. DDS is a vaporwave project that is known to have a lot of positive reception. Oh, I hadn't listened to it yet. I mentioned Death's Dynamic Shroud's Faith and Persona in one of my prior videos, and I liked that album quite a lot. It was great. Geometric Lullaby is a vaporwave label, and they got Begotten on it. Despite that, Towers is a kinda sort of not really vaporwave album. It's probably the very first ambient album I ever listened to. Actually, it isn't. Technically, The Endless River is. I also listened to Throbbing Crystal and Stalag before this. However, none of those are technically ambient. The Endless River is closer to ambient rock or post-rock. I am aware of how much shit I'll get for saying that. I stand by it. Throbbing Crystal is industrial rock, and Stalag just sucks. Towers isn't just ambient, but a special flavor. Dark ambient. Rather than giving us a soundscape of beats to study/relax to, we're given a strange liminal field that gives off a feeling of death, loss, decay, and aimlessness to study/relax to. Pat Chennington has a video on the subject, which is where I learned of the album. And while I do like his video, I'm making this is mine now. Divided into 4 acts, the album brings us through long fields of creepy Karman vortex infrasound, soundscapes that are close to what we know, but give the impending danger as we wander the towers. I want to try and summarize this more like a diary, as if the world we're entering is one we're exploring and lost in, and I want to describe how I feel when listening to the scapes. I would suggest you listen to the album on your own though. It's only an hour long and available on YouTube and Bandcamp. Some people may sleep in it, some may stay awake, some may get off to it. I'm moving on. Either way, I would recommend you listen to it, even if you don't typically listen to dense instrumentals. From a distant ambulance, we're dropped into a vast world of naissance electronic sounds. The droning chimes give off a pleasant yet liminal atmosphere. The album cover depicts a figure falling into the vast city, but we never hear the usual ambience of any kind of city. The environment is empty, but something is happening in the background. Distorted low-pitched voices come off after a blanket of electricity before the chimes resume. It feels as if we're walking through this environment, lost in trying to avoid the strange differences from our own reality. Fading maracas that sound like passing snakes, distorted crowds flying above, sounding fake and synthetic. The chiming continues all throughout the first part. It gives off the feeling that the environment is vast, echoing a large clock which is slowly ticking down, creating this large atmosphere of dread as we wander about its chambers. We're lost within it, trying to survive. I say that mainly because not only is it off-putting, but because of the first sign of danger. An electronic cry sounds after the beginning of what sounds like a marching band, a distorted marching band that begins to follow us. Wind chimes go off as the noise gets louder and louder. It's not the first time we'll hear it. As it vanishes off, a horn sounds off close by. Later, we hear the sound of fuzzy sewers and drops of water. Distant bells and cymbals go off, giving the sense of a beat, like the marching band from before, but it doesn't feel out of place. Now, it feels like the music to the environment. The deeper we go, the louder the clicks of distant water droplets hit, forming a rhythm that soothes us after, presumably, we hid from danger. After the long trek through the unusual roads, we emerge into a hostile environment filled with dense waves of wind and noise. A single hat gives us the beat needed, but it doesn't attach to the melody behind it. The world now seems cold and large, with winds flying around in the distance. A single bass hits us before we get a weirdly catchy beat. After part 1, it certainly still has that feeling of discomfort. Either a heartbeat or the pace of our steps, we continue on as the strings wrap around us, flying off and far away or rapidly approaching before dissipating. The rising electronic radio static later on gets a lot more unnerving as we move forward. Funny how once it returns, it almost makes the song feel like a song. Even as the unnerving cues kick in, there's still a format here compared to the first part. The noises make the environment feel alien. Exploring it makes you feel small as an ant, trying to navigate an urban structure not built for you, avoiding the dangers passing by while listening for the noises of the far off, only having your own heartbeat to keep you sane. Towards the end, it all goes calm and quiet. The sound of something else takes our view. It's almost ethereal and comforting to see. The high-pitched screams of something we don't understand with the fuzzy raindrops around us. Though the sight is strange, it's still uneasy. Still out of our range as the fuzz is overwhelming and the strange shrieks are distant. The ambience is overbearing and sets in much warmer than before, but that same lack of safety remains. Part 3 begins with a long drone that engulfs us. The bright haven we once explored is gone, and we're back to a much darker and confusing environment. Distant and unadored bells sound through the fog, along with what I think is a distorted cello. The sound of a voice passes us like they're calling over to us through the haze. It fades into the noise after a while. A strange alarm blares into our ears far, far louder than any other sound in the prior parts. The distant, peaceful ambience grows more unsettling as we continue, especially as this horn continues to engulf us. After the track, the soundscape is replaced by an even more alien environment. Trails of electronic noises dash by us and into the beyond. Louder and larger sounds stay distant and away, almost like we're navigating a field of beings beyond our understanding. Some get biased in their life, but others are curious and give off reverberated xylophones in their attempt to communicate. The fuzz returns as the noise grows frantic and louder, the sound of large raindrops falling onto the asphalt below, along with the fuzz. Not only a reflection of the environment we explored before, but now a far less welcoming version of it. The rain gets more dense, the electronic noises get louder, closer, and more distorted. The city we were lost in becomes threatening, something knows we're here. More chimes and marimbas sound along with a thick sub-bass as we explore the soundscape. The rain gets louder. The more we continue, the more lost we get, the more frightening and eerie the album is. Part 3 ends abruptly. We return to a more familiar ambience. Though different from the droning in Part 1, we hear some familiar noises. Wind chimes, cars driving by, the rainfall. Given what we encountered before, it feels much more familiar. However, the transposed synths above us tell us better. We're still lost in the distant towers, still lost in the environment. The rain grows hard for a moment as we continue. I've become a lot more jaded to albums like this, and even after all these years, this part is still extremely unnerving. The falling rain makes the world so lonely and quiet, and eerie. The sirens and distant thumps of something walking around clues us in more that we are far, far away from safety. And the bells, man, the bells. They're off in the distance, but they are creepy to listen to, almost like distant wind chimes alerting you of an approaching storm. Even as the sound of flowing water gives way to the same kind of haven, we're still at the mercy of something watering around this place. I love the distant sound of a chime playing in the background, giving off a distorted song that brings us familiarity. It's comforting at this point, though still creepy. Very nice to hear. Towards the end of the fourth part, we get the creepiest part of the album. The beginning drone of the first part mixed in with strange chimes that go on in a melodic fashion. Soft toms play with them and give off a beat to the unusual rhythm. We're back where we started, now even less familiar than before. The same sounds return as we wander, passing by the chimes that tick and talk over and over. The same electronic noises return and buzz about. Distant soft claps fade through the city with weird whispers heard from the inhabitants around. Once the storm stops, all we hear is the water exiting the gutter pipes, both from the hard drops into the containers but also into the sewers. Familiar drums begin to beat as something follows us. We return to the same drone after the storm, sticking to the sewers that gush water into the runway. Once exiting the sewer, return to where we started. Everything is far away, the wind is strong, and the noises remain. As the album winds down, a familiar, very human scream sounds off in an alleyway as we wander off. This is probably the most normal part of the album, and it's fittingly the most unusual. Unlike before, the alien environment presents itself as human. As lonely as it is, as desolate as it is, as unfamiliar as it is a creation of our making, one that human memory has trapped us inside. We expect a sense of community in our creations, but as it grows abandoned, all we see is the middle that is left behind. We wander through a world that is terrifying to navigate in that sense, especially as we try to avoid what unsettles us. When I first listened to this album, I had never listened to ambient music. And I mean albums designated and made for the ambient genre. I always thought it was out of my range, and this kind of long noise would never fit my style. And listening to Towers was difficult. It took 3 tries and several breaks my first times before I could finish because I had never been that unsettled before. I had never listened to albums that made me afraid and creeped out. It was hard, but after finally conquering it, it felt good. It was great. There's almost no other album that makes me feel as vividly as Towers. And even then, the few I have felt since just don't create such a vividly real world. Instead of the abstract concept album that is Towers, it's strange and alien, but all in the right way. Its image of a person falling into a dystopian dark urban realm, almost liminal, makes sense given how exotic and incomprehensible the world is and sounds. Everything feels like a threat, the world is cold and empty, and yet it is composed of the familiar. It leaves you creeped out and lost in a world that is always out to get you. If it wasn't for Towers, I never would have regularly listened to genres like dark ambient, noise, dark wave, vaporwave, and ambient. I would never bring myself to listen to slower drone projects designed out of strange noise compilations. Don't get me wrong, it took years to shed off that barrier, and even now, I need some time to adjust to projects like Set Fire to Flames or Consciousness Bleeds. However, Towers remains a special album because of it allowing me to really understand that music can disturb. It can make you feel unsafe and it can scare the shit out of you. Learning that brought me to artists like The Caretaker, Stalker, Robustum, and eventually to Daughters, though. That's a difficult subject for another day. And on a bonus note, listening to this album recently, it's weirdly sad. I didn't feel like I was experiencing something foreign fiction anymore. I wasn't even scared like I used to be until the fourth part, and only for the start of it. Once I thought I was a part of the world and as welcome as anyone else, now I sort of relate more and more to staying inside and avoiding the commute. Out of fear of being chased down or hurt by somebody who just doesn't want me there. I'm not the only one feeling this way, but there is one way Towers is blatantly showing this. It's liminality. 2019 was a golden year for dark ambient albums. That's when all the great ones came out and later blew up the year following. What they all had in common was the distortion of familiar spaces. Towers displays itself as an environment we fall into, a familiar location of Urbania, but one that is completely alien to us as we go deeper into it, finding its obscure underbellies, exploring its strange worlds, all while remaining in the same space surrounded by people we don't trust. It feels more melancholy and confusing, but it stays creepy and unnerving. It helps too that the album is paced fantastically. Not 1 second on any of the 4 parts is wasted. It gives off the atmosphere impeccably, all keeping you lost in its wave of noise, never once breaking the illusion besides the distant ambulance and the sudden shriek at the end. I cannot praise this album enough for how grand and beautiful it is. I don't listen to enough. That's how much I love it. Also, I'm scared of it. On the subject of liminality, it feels like a familiar distortion, a mirror reflection of our world, a colder derivative of it, which explores its blatant failures to all of us. It feels like exploring a world that is just so hostile and strange, but makes sense once you realize what it truly is.